For the past 200 years, there have been many strikes in our history. A group of Cree boatmen refused to work for the Hudson's Bay Company until they received a pay increase from 10 to 40 pelts per year. And this is often considered to be Canada's first strike, predating Confederation by up to 47 years. Now fast forward 52 years and we come to the highly impactful Toronto printer strike. This was one of the first major strikes in Canada's history. Printers in Toronto fought to bring in a 9-hour workday. The printers walked off the job on March 25th, 1872, and they actually had the support of the laborers in the city. The strike dragged on as the Toronto Globe publisher, George Brown, completely refused to give in to their demands. To stop the strike, he launched legal action that led to a strike committee being charged with criminal conspiracy. Our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, chose to be on the side of the strikers. His government eventually passed the Trade Union Act on April 18, 1872, which legalized and protected unions, although picketing was still illegal. He didn't do this out of a love for unions, but more of his hatred of his political rival George Brown, who was one of the founders of the Liberal Party. That strike failed, but it did inspire the 9-hour movement that did achieve the success of having a 9-hour workday. Then there was the first general strike in 1918, which was triggered by the death of Albert Ginger Goodwin. He was a labor activist in British Columbia, but the most important strike of them all, with the possible exception of the asbestos strike in 1949 in Quebec, was the Winnipeg General Strike. And that is today's video topic. Today, Winnipeg is the 6th largest city in Canada, but a century ago, it was the country's 3rd largest city, behind only Montreal and Toronto. It was a major railway hub, and still is, and it was one of the most important cities in Canada, but people were struggling following the First World War. By 1919, the unemployment rate was climbing, rising from 4% to 7%, and within 2 years, it would reach 14%. Many had prospered during the war, but with hostilities over, production cutbacks began, and returning soldiers found that they didn't have the same jobs that they hoped to on their return. With few jobs for returning veterans, housing and food prices began to rise, making things difficult for many Canadians. In Winnipeg, with its large population of working-class immigrants, things were especially tough. In the city, workers wanted job security and higher pay to deal with this changing economic landscape. Company owners, however, were just fine with keeping things the way they were. They were making big profits while keeping those wages down. And at the same time, socialist ideas were on the rise among many Canadians. And in March 1919, a meeting of Western Labour delegates took place in Calgary where various resolutions were adopted, including pushing for a 5-day work week and 6-hour days. The delegates also called for the One Big Union to unite workers from many different industries all together. And although this union wouldn't exist until June 1919, well after the Winnipeg General Strike began. At the start of May 1919, several strikes were staged in Winnipeg by workers to get the notice of employers and begin talks. When this failed, the Winnipeg Trades and Labour Council called a general strike on May 15, 1919. In just a few hours, 30,000 men and women walked off the job. Factories in the city shut down, shops closed, trains stopped, and many public employees joined in the strike, including police, postal workers, telephone and telegraph operators, firemen, and utilities workers. A central strike committee was formed to coordinate everything, with committee members elected from various unions in the city. And one of the first acts from this committee was to ask the police, utility workers, and other essential workers to go back on the job to ensure those services were not shut down in the city. A newspaper was established named Strike Bulletin that was published daily to provide information on negotiations and strike plans. The newspaper told strikers to be peaceful and that, quote, the only thing the workers have to do to win this strike is to do nothing. Just eat, sleep, play, love, laugh, and look at the sun. Our fight consists of doing no fighting. As soon as the strike began, Winnipeg's business leaders and politicians formed the Citizens Committee of 1,000 to oppose the strike. The committee called the strike a revolutionary plot that was organized by, in their words, alien scum. They refused to hear the demands of the strikers, and the newspapers joined the committee in condemning the strike. The Winnipeg Citizen reported that the general strike was a revolution and an attempt to overthrow the government. The federal government was very much on the side of Winnipeg business leaders and civic leaders. At the time, the federal government was led by the Conservatives under Sir Robert Borden. Technically, though, this was the Union government that had been formed in 1917 in a merger between Conservatives and Liberals who supported conscription, and that would lead to the conscription crisis. The government worried that the strike would spark other general strikes throughout Canada. And to prevent this, Gideon Robertson, Minister of Labour, and Arthur Meehan, Minister of the Interior and Minister of Justice and future Prime Minister, went to Winnipeg. Even though they were in Winnipeg, they refused to meet with the strikers and instead spent their time with the Citizens Committee. Meehan, in a statement, said that the strike was, quote, a cloak for something far deeper, an effort to overturn the proper authority. The government, backed by the Citizens Committee, threw its support publicly behind the employers. An order was put out to fire any federal worker who did not go back to work. Borden's government, which at the time had the largest majority in Canadian history, also amended the Immigration Act so that British-born immigrants could be deported. It also changed the definition of sedition under the Criminal Code to be broader. Meanwhile, the strike continued, and support for it from Canadians continued to increase. One of the most notable figures of the strike at this time was Helen Armstrong, who was also known simply among the strikers as Ma. She was one of two women on the Central Strike Committee. She created the Labour Cafe, which provided women strikers with 3 free meals per day. Men were also welcome at the cafe and were asked to simply make a donation. While veterans held marches in the streets to support the strike, Mayor Charles Gray of Winnipeg banned all public demonstrations beginning on June 5th. 4 days later, the city fired the entire police force after officers refused to promise to not be sympathetic to the strikers. In place of a trained police force, untrained but better paid special constables were sent into the streets armed with clubs. Only hours after they hit the streets, one constable charged into the strikers and was dragged from his horse and beaten. On June 17th, the government stepped things up and arrested 10 leaders with the Central Strike Committee and 2 members of the One Big Union, which had just recently formed. In response, strikers held a silent parade on June 21st to support the leaders who were arrested. Many of those in the parade were veterans who supported the strikers. And once they reached City Hall, the parade had grown to include thousands of people. Mayor Gray called in the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, who charged into the crowd to disperse them. And when a streetcar came through, operated by a strike breaker, it was tipped over and set on fire by the marchers. At this point, the mayor read the Riot Act, and the Mounties charged back into the crowd once again. As they did, they fired 120 shots. This left 2 people dead, and over 30 people were injured. Another 80 were arrested. The day became known in Winnipeg as Bloody Saturday. And by the end of the day, federal troops were walking in the streets of the city. To quell tempers, police released 6 labor leaders, but then they went on to arrest Fred Dixon and J.S. Woodsworth, who were the editors of the strike bulletin. Police then put a stop to the publication of the newspaper. With the government and employers now united together against the strikers, the end was near for the strike. On June 25th, the strike committee announced there would be a return to work. After the strike, 7 strike leaders were convicted of planning to topple the government. They received sentences of 6 months to 2 years. Woodsworth, who went on to found the Canadian Cooperative Federation, which is the precursor to the modern-day NDP, had his charges dropped. While the Winnipeg General Strike did not achieve its goals for workers, it showed that workers could come around a common goal, and the strike began a period of increased activism and unionism in Canada. Across the country, workers supported the strikers and later held their own strikes. And among the leaders of the Winnipeg General Strike, many went into politics. 3 strike leaders, George Armstrong, William Evans, and John Queen, were elected to the Manitoba legislature in 1920 while still serving time in prison for the strike. Queen actually went on to serve 7 terms as the mayor of the city. Wordsworth, who I mentioned founded the CCF, was elected to Parliament in 1921 and remained in Parliament until his death in 1942. Abraham Heaps was later elected to Parliament in 1925 and served until 1940. Now, one person who saw Bloody Saturday happen right in front of him was a young Tommy Douglas, and seeing the violence on the street left a significant mark on him. The incident influenced his desire to create the Saskatchewan Bill of Rights in 1947. It was the first Bill of Rights enacted in the British Commonwealth since the original Bill of Rights was enacted by the English Parliament in 1689. It would later greatly influence the Bill of Rights established by John Diefenbaker. And that's the story of the Winnipeg General Strike, one of the most important moments in Canadian history.